Exciting. We're going to go to our next keynote speaker. And he has actually a pretty interesting conversation starter as a topic. And the topic is the AI will make banks and fintechs disappear. But he also has an amazing background. He's actually spent the early part of his career as a professional musician touring in the USA. And in 2017, he became increasingly interested in financial technology and joined a company called Wonga and built up an extensive amount of fintech experience. With that said, I'd like to introduce our second keynote speaker. Give him a big round of applause. Daniel Heg. Yes. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Hello, good afternoon. Oh, this is exciting. My name is Daniel Heg. I'm the founder of a company called Habito. We're a small group of engineers, mathematicians, designers, mortgage experts on a mission to try and kind of recreate the mortgage industry with the customer at its core rather than on its outskirts where it lives now. I wanted to talk to you about a few things today. The first of which, rather than engaging in too much kind of future gazing about technology, but was more focused on the emotional truths that go on in customers' lives when they're making large financial decisions. The second is the kind of the frailty and suggestibility of the human mind and the effect of marketing on that. And the third is the impact that potentially AI, machine learning, whatever form of clever arithmetic can have in easing some of those burdens. So I'd like to start at the beginning of my own journey. Can I just get a quick show of hands on who's got or been through a mortgage application? Okay, good. It's always good to gauge the level of trauma in the room, and you all look pretty upset, so that's good. So my journey began 3 or 4 years ago. I was, I guess, early 30s buying my first house in London, which, if you're familiar with the London property market, is quite a steep hill to climb. And I had already been working in financial services for several years, but realized that actually I was pretty unfamiliar with the mortgage landscape, and I felt like I needed some help fathoming what was the correct product for me and what was the right lender and what I should be focusing on. So I went off into the world and found myself a mortgage broker whose job it was to survey the market and find the right product for me. And we alighted upon a product from one of the big retail lenders in the UK, and he sent off my application. Now, he made a bit of an error in that because he included myself, my wife, and my wife again on the application. So 10 days later, the bank came back and declined the application on the basis that I was perhaps a polygamist or a bigamist or involved in some problematic behavior. So obviously I was a little upset, highly pressurized situation. I'm trying to buy a house here and we can't even get the basics right. So he sends the application again. This time, he removes me from the application and just sends an application with my wife and my wife on it. 10 days later, declined again on the basis of identity fraud or what have you. And eventually we got there. But all the way through this, we've got a seller who doesn't think that we're creditworthy and we're going to be able to complete on the transaction. And we're at probably the most anxious point that we've ever been in our young family's life. And I kind of came away from it like partially kind of blown away by the comical incompetence of the thing, but also really conscious of the level of like, disempowerment I felt, that I had no comprehension of how the machine worked beyond the broker, nor of how the market more broadly worked, but also recognition that at a point there, I would have paid pretty much anything to finish it. I was, as all of us are, nobody is interested in mortgages. People are only interested in owning homes. Homes are very much the canvas on which we kind of paint our dreams about, living good lives and raising good families. And the mortgage is purely a means to fulfilling that vision. And that is a huge and confusing factor when you're trying to make a perfectly rational financial decision. So I kind of came away from that, with a pretty strong urge to try and solve this problem for lots of people, which is what we do at Habito, but also kind of with a more burning question on the basis on which we make these kinds of decisions as humans. How, when we are effectively emotional beings trying to reach kind of touch points in our plan for life, can we make rational economic decisions? And so I guess if you broaden the scope a little, we can start to consider how does a consumer decide whether they should hold money on credit cards while simultaneously holding money in savings. We see this all the time, particularly in the UK. You'll see somebody paying 18.9% APR on a credit card, with a £5,000 balance and holding £5,000 in savings, earning 0.7%. It's completely irrational, but it speaks to the fundamental the human need to hold some cash, to have something, a barrier in terms of emergency, even if we're paying very significant costs to do that. And this is true of everything. What's the right amount of coverage? Should you be paying into your savings or your pension? These are all questions that we are not particularly well designed as humans to think about. So how are these decisions made? And the truth is that they're largely made by advertising. So we are bombarded day in, day out, teaser rates, refer a friend schemes, balance transfer, whatever it might be, or at a more facile level, celebrity endorsements, sing-along tunes of bank clerks, all of these things there to ask us to substitute an important question about our financial lives for a simple question. Do we like the song? Is this celebrity somebody we respect? Will we save some money right now? And I think if you've ever looked into the work of either Daniel Kahneman or Amos Tversky, you'll see some interesting experimental work that's been done that describes some of these effects and the effect of advertising on this frail human conception. So there was an experiment that they did in the early 2000s where, and I'm going to paraphrase it slightly for brevity, but essentially they arranged a series of fridge poetry, so a series of nouns and verbs and adjectives on a wall here, and asked the experimental participant to arrange those words however they wanted. They were then asked to walk down a corridor, which I think was something like 100 paces or so, and they were timed as they walked. And then at the end of that corridor, they entered a room where they were asked to take 2 chairs and set them up in preparation for a conversation between 2 people. And the 2 things that were being measured were A, the amount of time it took to walk along this corridor, and B, the distance between those 2 chairs. Now, I guess, I don't know what your instinctive reaction is, but I wouldn't have expected there to be much impact on playing with some fridge poetry or some adjectives on a wall on that. That was not the case. So in the case where these words were focused on infirmity, on being elderly, being aged, being unwell, there was a significant slowdown in this walk, about a 40% reduction in the pace of somebody walking from here to here. Everybody the same age, everybody controlled for. The chairs were set up at kind of an average distance, so not a huge impact on that. When these were set up with words about vitality, about youth, about energy, as you might imagine, the pace of walking much higher indeed, and these 2 chairs on the other side of the room much closer together. So again, cognitive priming, unconscious biases expressing themselves through the use of, the most simple form of marketing, you might argue. The one that I found the most curious, and I guess maybe the most disturbing, was that when they used words that were to do with money, money, financial life, savings, so on and so forth, what they found was not only was the walking to the other side of the room slow, but the chairs were set up significantly further apart. And the body language of the people sitting in those chairs was much more negative. So there's a lesson here that money, cognitively, makes us selfish, makes us afraid that people are going to take things from us, and makes it difficult for us to see the broader context of what's going on. So with that in mind, we spent quite a lot of time talking to our customers, trying to fathom what their psychological state was at the point of taking a mortgage. And we were really shocked, and it was interesting. So you would see there was an initial kind of protestation from the customer that they were an economically rational actor, and they were just looking at the data and making decisions. But what we found as we went deeper, and we used a firm of chartered psychologists, that after about 34 minutes of a good focus group, they would start to break. And the first person would admit, I actually don't really understand what my mortgage rate is, I actually don't understand the difference between a fixed rate and a variable, and I just made a choice on the basis of what I was told to do. And as soon as one person breaks, the rest of the people in the group start to break. And what we found was then, when we asked them to describe perhaps, the kind of animals that lenders made them think of, or kind of other ways for them to represent their mental state, they picked predators. They picked sharks, they picked wolves, and they very much positioned themselves as this kind of gazelle in the savannah, afraid to make a decision on their own finances, which is pretty disturbing if you kind of conceive of that, particularly when you're sitting on the other side trying to work out how to help these people. So what we focused on very much then was the humanization of the product. Like, how do we bring this customer in to what is, and we're a tech business, we are a FinTech through and through who use algorithms to search for products and give mortgage advice, how do you find a humanistic component that allows you to build trust? How do you recognize that fear in a consumer and make it okay and seek to serve it? And I'll come back to that in a moment. So to take a step back, so if we now, bearing in mind that I guess the top 5 US banks, so well, not banks, but financial institutions, so the JP Morgans, the Amex, the Cap One, each spent at least $1 billion just in the US, just in 2016. We have got incredible volumes of cash and brilliant minds and advertising agencies and creatives all working on the underpinnings of human cognition and choice, and they're all working to encourage consumers to swap short-term incentives for long-term incentives, to answer the easy question rather than the difficult question. So how might we go about solving that? So let's kind of remove the subjective lens and look at it purely objectively, just for a moment. So take my financial life. So my life is, I've got the constellation of debt and savings, and I own a home, and I need life insurance, and I should probably be paying into a pension, which I'm not. And ultimately, this constellation of products surrounds me. This information is knowable, right? Like my current account transaction data is knowable. The amount of savings I have is knowable. My credit rating and my previous performance is knowable. They are all effectively numbers. On the other side, the market as a whole is knowable. So you can, there's price comparison websites universally which will allow you to see the entire market arranged by rates, sometimes filtered by eligibility or product type or whatever. But effectively, 2 data sources that are, in effect, both sides of what is not a very complex optimization problem. There's not need to predict the future. This isn't a kind of complex machine vision or AI problem. This is relatively simple arithmetic. And actually, were that arithmetic, let's call it, for the sake of conversation, an AI financial advisor who looked at both sides of that equation and made recommendations to me, we would expect them to be accurate. And actually, we would expect that financial advisor to see through the short-term incentives, to hopefully avoid some of the perverse incentives that will occur in the mis-selling of products, to not be confused by what could cost them something today, but will cost them certainly much more later. Just seen the Wonga question. So bearing all of that in mind, wouldn't that be the best solution possible? Would it not be the optimal situation if a customer could effectively give over all responsibility for their financial lives to a rational machine, to an AI financial advisor? So coming back to what I initially said, perhaps the answer is no. So what we found is when we talk to consumers about this, effectively this delegation of authority, complete hands-off financial management, they get very nervous. They're fundamentally distrustful of machines. And there's some very good research in a couple of places, but one piece from University College London that looks at how trust is built in humans. And trust is built in humans on the basis of moral rules, and the adherence to those moral rules is not built on consequentialism. So if you take the example of diagnostics, so there are now very, very brilliant expert systems that can diagnose illness in patients at much higher levels of accuracy than a human doctor. But humans overwhelmingly would prefer the inaccurate diagnosis of a human to the accurate diagnosis of a machine. Why is that? Why is that? And it's partially the way we're built in our neurochemistry, but it's also because the doctor giving you the diagnosis believes he is telling you the truth. He believes he is accurate. He fundamentally believes he's giving you the right information. Whereas the machine is conscious of its own error rate. It is conscious that perhaps you are the 1 in 100 people who it's going to misdiagnose and going to miss something fundamental. And that is disturbing. It is disturbing to us as humans, and we like to function and make decisions on the basis of belief and what others believe rather than perfect knowledge. So let's bring that back to our business, just as it is where I'm most comfortable. So what we found was our first version of our product, and this is completely my fault, was a very, very mechanical, very light version, effectively a series of graphs, and if I could have reduced it just to a command line, I probably would, which said, you've given us all the information, we've looked at the market, this is the product you should get, do you want us to go and get it for you? Needless to say, conversion was not brilliant. It turned out that my view of the world was not necessarily the consumer's view of the world. And what we found was, when we introduced a human into the process, even though we made it completely clear that that human was not doing the research, was not filling in the forms, was not even the fundamental arbiter of the advice, was just there as a friendly face, as someone to hold hands with, as you go through a difficult process, we saw our conversion rates radically change. So customers were willing to make rational decisions about their financial lives as long as there was a human that they could touch, not literally touch, but someone they could find in this process. So what that said to us was, okay, so is that scalable? Yes, it's scalable to a degree, but ultimately, what does that mean for financial services brands overall? So let's say that if the consumer is willing to now release the wheel, they're willing to say, listen, you choose whether I use American Express or Capital One or HSBC or Santander, then what does that mean for those financial services brands? Where are these billions of dollars in marketing spend going to go if you've got a perfectly rational AI financial advisor making decisions for you? And I guess there's two obvious kind of battlegrounds that could go on. So one, if advertising ceases to be viable, then maybe all of that, this is the optimistic view, all of that money just goes straight to reducing costs for consumers. And suddenly we've got a kind of hyper-efficient race to the bottom being driven by AI financial advisors always picking the right products at the right time. Maybe. I think optimistic. The second is eligibility. So at the moment, customers are generally shoehorned into pretty broad eligibility and affordability constructs to allow them to buy products. But actually, there's probably optimal pricing for each and every one of us. And that optimal pricing and eligibility probably sits in relation to the other products you already have and the compound risk, if you like, of your financial life. So is it possible that instead of spending all of our money on television advertising, we would spend it on trying to fathom and build better algorithms for solving those problems? And that becomes interesting now because we've got a kind of a raft of consumer AI financial advisors on this side, optimizing single users' consumer lives. But now we've got a set of corporate AIs who are looking at the same sets of data and trying to optimize the product selection for that consumer. And so on and so forth. We have these two sets of AIs warring forever. Now, ultimately, I think coming back to the kind of the human component, that is unlikely. I don't think the humans are ever going to take their hands completely off the wheel. But what could occur is that we see, if you like, an intermediation of trust. So for the moment, we are building our trust relationships with our banks and credit cards really on the basis of a historical hangover, right? Like you used to pick the biggest bank because it had the thickest walls and the strongest vault, and you believed ultimately your money was safe there and nobody was going to run away. Those days are over. And the way that it's nicely described, I think, is as a separation between mechanical trust and associative trust. So mechanical trust being the idea that you can trust your bank not to lose your money, that your debit card's going to work, that your direct debit's going to come out on time. And I would argue that the traditional players are strong in that. Associative trust is the belief that the person on the other side of the table is working in your best interests, that they share and follow the same moral rules as you. Right now, financial services is very weak in that, but you might argue that fintech is stronger. So if you sit down and talk to a traditional banker right now, the fear is that there's a natural intermediation of trust that could come into fintech, where these AI financial advisors are able to aggregate these products and earn the trust of the consumer, consequently commoditizing or distancing or disaggregating, whatever you like to call it, the banks further down the chain. Now, if that's true, that's exciting in some, assuming that all of us are generally interested in fintech. That's a bright future for real consumer benefit and a kind of re-architecting of the consumer purchase journey. But also, and I think it speaks to one of the questions I saw earlier, an incredible moral hazard, right? So now the consumers, they've taken their eye off the road. They're starting to believe there's a human component that has been built and there is trust in the underlying brand. How do we make sure that we, as entrepreneurs or creators or workers in any of these business, create a kind of auditable set of algorithmic logic that can be seen by the consumer, who's not very interested and wants to make an easier decision, can be seen by the regulator, and can get a sense of the underlying mechanics, but more importantly, can be seen by ourselves as brands. So how do we find a kind of corporate logic for how we go through and make these decisions on the behalf of consumers who I believe will be more and more allocating trust to us and resource and allowing us to make those calls. That's it. Any questions?
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Give him a big round of applause. Daniel.
Thank you.
And insightful talk, but before you leave, there's something that's also been on my mind for the last couple of years already. You talked about fairness of a system, fairness of potential AI, the inclusion of mechanical Turks to figure out whether or when not someone should get a mortgage or not. So how do you factor this in terms of trust, reputation and relationship on an individual level? Let's say you work at a corporate bank and you earn 200K a year, and then you quit your job, go for the startup journey, and then all of a sudden you're not allowed to get a credit card or a mortgage.
You need a mortgage.
The question is, do you need a mortgage? Yes, of course, I mean, digital nomads might not own a house in the future, but how do you factor that type of fairness into a system that actually benefits consumers?
It's a great question. So what we see is, so we're, our demography is slightly younger than the national average. So we see huge numbers of under 35s and typically contractors trying to solve this exact problem. And general eligibility at bank level refuses them. There is no interest in trying to mediate multiple incomes and make a call, which is actually, I think, where these finer grained, these kind of more advanced, a more advanced view of the consumer that's more multidimensional, gives a better hope for that customer being able to get a mortgage. But right now, like that, it's a difficult time. Like unless you've got a few years of accounts and you've proven your new nomadic lifestyle, it's not going to happen.
So you talked a bit about as well, we're going from human to human interaction to machine interaction. We're seeing this in different industries right now, right? The convergence of blockchain, IoT, you see smart doors, smart locks, cars doing payments, micropayments via actually autonomous. How do you keep it explainable as well? So in your particular business, how do you explain?
It's a great question. It's the hardest thing because you've got a continuum, right? Either you are patriarchal, patronizing, keep it simple, just do as I say, or you try and kind of open the kimono and expose the mechanics of the industry, and everybody's already, in fact, people start leaving. So trying to find this balance of like understanding I don't love the word, but the literacy of the consumer and matching the information to them is absolutely key to what we do, because we find A, it's the right thing for the consumer, but B, it radically affects our conversion. So if we don't get it right, the customer disappears.
Will you be here the rest of the day, and how can people reach out?
Yes, and I'd be very happy to answer the longer question if you want to come and find me.
Excellent. Okay, great. Give him a big round of applause. Daniel Haggerty.